suppression and voter intimidation looks like, and to have some resources to deal with voter suppression and intimidation if it occurs. Another thing we're going to want to keep in mind is this whole thing that we're talking about today is in light of the political climate, which includes obviously the pandemic. It includes racial uprisings, historic disenfranchisement, all of those things. So that's all going to be woven into what we're talking about today. So a little bit about Positive Women's Network. It's the only national organization in the US which is led by and for women and women of trans experience living with HIV. It was founded in 2008 by 28 diverse women living with HIV, which included women of trans experience. And today we're over 3,000 members nationwide, and we have chapters in Colorado, Louisiana, New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Texas. We also have state leads in another 12 states, and our mission is to prepare and involve women living with HIV in all of our diversity in all levels of policy and decision making. So why are we here today? It comes as no surprise to you, I'm sure, that the current administration and others that are currently in power are doing everything that they can to undermine this election. They're already challenging vote by mail procedures. They're encouraging white supremacists and others to intimidate voters at the polls. And they're questioning the results of the election even before people have voted. And the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, is layered on top of all of this, which makes in-person voting even more risky and brings challenges to going and voting as well. So with that, the three big safety risks at the polls are, of course, COVID-19 and the pandemic, voter suppression, voter intimidation, and white supremacist terror. And I think most people at this point kind of understand the background of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to move on to kind of explaining what voter suppression and voter intimidation are and what they look like before we talk about how to deal with all of these safety risks. So what is voter suppression? So voter suppression is any effort to prevent eligible voters from registering to vote or from voting. So some examples of this are voter ID laws, restricting voting times, restricting registration, and purging the voter rolls. And here is just a little graphic about how systematic voter suppression works. So it can happen before voting, during voting, and after voting. So some of the ways it can happen before voting is by delaying voter registration, you get the voter registration application, but then you take too long to process it. So it's processed late. It's not mailing mail-in ballots properly to people, so they get them late or they get them without sufficient time to mail them back. And it's also restricting access to the ballot unfairly or unequally across different communities and different groups of people. During voting, voter suppression can look like consolidating voting precincts, so it makes polling locations even harder to reach. And that's especially happens now during COVID-19, and the justification being that we need to consolidate these voting precincts because we don't have as many poll workers because of COVID, but it often means that it makes it more difficult to vote and it makes lines longer, which is another voter suppression tactic is extremely long wait times, long lines at the polls. We've obviously, of course, seen that in almost every early voting location. I know Georgia, I think, just recently had like 11-hour lines. Miami did as well. Some other ways this can show up is rejecting mail-in ballots without providing sufficient time to correct the issues by mail, and then polling locations running out of different types of ballots. And then after voting, it can look like delays in how the votes are counted or not counting them correctly and things like that. So that's just a little background on systematic voter suppression and how that works. So then we can go into voter intimidation. So I kind of think of this as a little bit of like a subset of voter suppression because the goal of voter intimidation is to get people to not vote or to change their preferences. And so it's conduct intended to make a potential voter either vote against what they would like to vote or to not vote at all by causing that person fear. And it can be really subtle and depending on the circumstances. I know this picture I have here is very overt, but it can show up in a lot of different ways. So it doesn't just have to be people with guns at the polls. It can be something like people aggressively approaching a car and then taking down a driver's license number. It can be harassing voters, asking them about their qualifications to vote. And then, of course, it can also be violence and harassment and showing up with weapons at the polls, patrolling, doing kind of like police-like activities at the polls that these militia groups have been called on to do, really aggressive watching of the polls. But it also can include conduct that generally would be legal, but it becomes illegal when it's used to intimidate people not to vote. So, like I said, the taking down the license plate number example, that's conduct that's generally legal, but if you're doing it to make it so that people don't vote, then that's not okay, and that's voter intimidation. Just a little note about this graphic. We'll talk more about resources later on about if you do encounter voter suppression and voter intimidation at the polls. This is a text line where if you see firearms at a polling location, you can text guns down to this text number, and they'll connect you with the National Voter Protection Hotline. I do want to flag, though, that one thing that if it is a credible thing, their website does say that they might get law enforcement involved. So if that's not what you want, I'll provide you different information later about resources that don't involve law enforcement. But this is a resource as well for voter intimidation specifically related to guns. So what do we do to deal with all of these risks that we have at a poll? And I think the number one thing that we can do is to make our voting plan early, which would mean as soon as possible at this point because people are already voting. So I have some of the early voting deadlines listed here. The first one coming up, and this is in like the 9 Deep South states. The first one coming up is actually in Louisiana, and it's tomorrow is the early voting deadline. But when you're making your voting time, either pick an early voting time to go vote or pick a time on election day when you can go vote. So think about, am I going to go before work, after work? Do I not work that day? So I can go, at a time when the polls will be less crowded. So really think about exactly when and where you're going to go vote. You can find your polling location online, either through your county board of elections, or you can find it through iwillvote.com. The one thing I would like to know on election day, another voter suppression tactic, which I don't think I had listed, is they will sometimes last minute change polling locations. So make sure to check day of that the polling location is actually the correct one. And the best way to do that is on your county board of elections website, or you can call your county board of elections. And sometimes it's called the supervisor of elections, county board of elections, different things depending on your state. But that's where you can kind of access that information. Just some notes about these early voting deadlines. So technically, Mississippi and Alabama don't have early voting. They have a system that's called in-person absentee voting. So in those states, you can go to the county elections office and you can fill in your absentee ballot right there. Or I'm sorry, your absentee request form for your mail-in ballot. But then they can hand it to you right there. You can fill out your ballot at the same time and then turn all of that stuff in together. In Alabama this year, everybody is allowed to do that absentee in-person process until this deadline of October 29th. However, in Mississippi, it's still really, really restricted who can do it. So to get more details on that, you'll be able to look it up on iwillvote.com. Just some tips for when you're making your voting plan and picking your times to vote. Generally, earlier in the morning and mid-afternoon tend to be the least crowded times to vote. I would also say that if you can, it's good to set up some type of coordination between your networks and communities to kind of monitor how long the lines are and what might be a good time to vote, especially if you can be a little flexible with it. I know I've done this on like a local neighborhood Facebook page. I drive by our early voting location most mornings And so I'll send a text and say, like, hey, the lines are really long today, or the lines are really, really short today. It might be a good day to go vote. To update the status of the lines. And that might be a good way that, people in your communities or you yourself might be able to find a good time to go vote if you can be a little flexible with it. The one note I'll have is for most election information, social media is not always the best place to get it unless you're communicating with like close friends and family members and communities that you really trust, because it is a pretty easy way to spread disinformation. So when you are looking at information, make sure you're considering what type of bias that person might have, and also why they might be providing the information they're providing. But it can be a really useful tool, especially for things like when to go vote. So just some other tips when you're making your voting plan about how to stay safe while you're voting during a pandemic. So like we said, if possible, vote early, or at least try and go vote when it's least crowded. And then also try and leave non-voting family members at home if you can. Obviously that gets complicated, especially during the pandemic when we're trying to all limit our exposures to people outside our household, but if it's possible, that's really best. And then we also want to reduce any risky activities beforehand. And when I talk about risky activities, things like not wearing your mask, being at crowded events, in-person dining, those types of things. And really the reason is because we want to make sure we're protecting our communities when we're voting. And that includes everyone who's standing next to you in line. So you want to try and make sure that you have done the most you can do to keep yourself COVID-free prior to going to vote, so that they can actually have a safe experience at the polls as well. And you can too. So we're trying to just make it so that all of our communities are safe at the polls. Also, we're going to try and wash our hands before and after voting if we can. Sometimes we, of course, don't want to be lingering in indoor spaces. So hand sanitizer is fine too. But yeah, just try and clean your hands before you go and touch the polling areas. Some other things to find out about when you're making your voting plan is some of these questions, and I'll go through them, but really what I'd like to flag here is for some states and some counties, you're actually allowed to go if you're early voting. And again, double check this with your county board of elections and make sure this is correct for your area. But at least here, I live in Jacksonville, Florida. Here we're allowed to vote at any early polling location in the county. So we can actually shift around to a safer location for us, depending on the precautions the polling place is taking and things like that, and how spread out it's going to be. So if you can find out this information early, you might be able to go vote at a safer location. So some of the things you might want to try and find out is, does your district offer curbside voting? If so, is it only at specific locations, or is it every location? Can you bring your sample ballot into the voting booth? The important thing about bringing your sample ballot in is it can really speed up the process if you don't have to completely think about every single ballot provision or candidate while you're in the voting booth. You can just take your sample ballot that you've already written, bring it in there with you, and really speed up the process so you're in there for less amount of time. Also, find out what precautions the polling place is taking. So are you going to be waiting in line inside or outside if there is a line? Is everyone going to be wearing a mask? Is physical distancing going to be maintained? And with that, it's also, I find it easier if there's visible distance markers, and that actually helps other people maintain 6-foot distance. So are those going to be present? Is there a separate entrance in and out of the voting area? Are there barriers between the voters and the poll workers? Are the poll workers going to be wearing PPE? And is there adequate space between the voting privacy booths? And are all the frequently touched surfaces going to be sanitized regularly as well? So try and find as much out about what precautions polling places are taking so that you can come prepared as well. If they're not sanitizing things, maybe that just means you bring a few extra disinfecting wipes so you can clean off your surfaces before you go and vote. So that's why that's important. All right, and then once we know when and where we're voting, and we've got our whole setup about, how we're going to do that, then we also want to get together our voting toolkit before we go to vote, so we make sure we have everything we need. And this might seem like a really long list, and you might think it's a little bit much, but the thing is, we want to prepare for the worst, and hopefully we don't need any of this. Well, some of it we will need, but we want to prepare for the worst, but then hopefully we don't need it. So obviously you're going to want to bring your mask, which covers your nose and your mouth. I did a little bit of research on this. Apparently cotton masks with 2 to 3 layers of protection, or one with the filter, those tend to work best. Bandanas and the gaiters, which you just pull up over from your neck, those are least effective. But anything's better than nothing. But yeah, those cotton masks are best. Bring your pen along if you can. I didn't think about this before I went to go vote, early voting here, and they just had the one pen on the chain that everybody has touched 6 million times. So I'd really suggest bringing your own pen. I'd try and find out if you need a black or blue. If you can't find out, bring both, just so you cover your bases there and you have the right color pen. Make sure you bring some tissues, hand sanitizer, like I said, so we can keep our hands clean before we go vote. Disinfecting wipes. Make sure you bring your ID if it's required in your area. And generally they have a list of different IDs that you can use on the Secretary of State website for your state. And then some type of hand covering, so gloves, finger cover, cotton swab. The thing about the cotton swab is I did find out that for those touchscreen voting machines, cotton swabs actually work to touch those, so you don't have to touch them. After you use that, you're going to want to throw it away as soon as possible. Bring an emergency contact sheet just in case. Snacks and water in case you encounter long lines. Also, in case you encounter long lines, I saw a lot of people in Georgia who were waiting in those 11-hour lines had fold-out chairs, and I thought that was a great idea, especially if you have issues standing for long periods of time. That's a really fantastic way to do that. Any type of medication that you need to take intermittently throughout the day, or if you have to take it at a specific time. So if you happen to go vote and you do encounter a long line, you don't want to have to leave because you need an inhaler or insulin, or it's time to take your HIV medication, you didn't bring it with you. So you want to make sure that you have that there so that you can really wait in line and exercise your right to vote if you need to. I'd also suggest bringing the election protection hotline number, and that can be something even as simple as just having it in your phone or on a piece of paper with you, so that you have it just in case you do encounter issues there. And then the last thing is just weather preparedness, so sunscreen if it's hot and a hat, sweater if it's cold, raincoat if it might rain. Here in Florida we have an afternoon rain shower every day, so if I had long lines and it was 2 o'clock, I would be out of luck if I didn't have a raincoat along. So once you've prepared your voting toolkit, I would also suggest reading up about your rights at the polls. So I'm going to cover 3 main sections. So guns, encountering terrorist groups, and then also if your right to vote is challenged. So I'm going to give a really brief overview about your rights, but I'd suggest I'm going to provide some resources so that you can look at your specific state and see what your rights are there. So in terms of guns, I was actually really surprised to learn that they are actually prohibited from polling places in Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In Mississippi and South Carolina, only open carry firearms are allowed at a polling location. So one thing I never really had thought about before, but when firearms are normally not allowed in a place, so like a school, you're never allowed to bring a firearm in a school. It doesn't mean that people are then allowed to bring them there when it becomes a polling location. They're still not allowed. So if you're concerned about encountering people with firearms at your polling location, this is another opportunity where if your county allows you to switch your polling location during the early voting period, you could switch it to somewhere that normally prohibits firearms, and that could be a good way to do it. And then just one more note, even if firearms are allowed at a polling place. They can't be used to intimidate voters. That's still not okay. And yeah, that's the basic guns overview. We'll talk a little later about how you should, the steps you can take for voter intimidation, voter suppression as well. So knowing your rights about terrorist groups, these armed militia groups that we keep hearing about and that certain people keep encouraging to show up at polling locations. So it may be comforting to know that all 50 states actually prohibit these private unauthorized militias and military style units from engaging in activities which are reserved for the state militia. That language is a little confusing. It's very vague because there are state-specific rules on what exactly is allowed and what's not allowed. I have a link here where you can look up in your state what's permitted and what's not. But generally, it includes like law enforcement type activities, like patrolling around, trying to maintain, public safety type roles. Those are generally not allowed for these terrorist groups to engage in. So the other thing to know about voting and your rights is in some states, other citizens, other people are allowed to challenge your right to vote. And in some states, only poll workers are allowed to do this. In some states, it's only like poll workers and candidates, and then some, it's everybody. You can find your state-specific laws here. And also just to note, I have a resources page at the end with all of this information in it that I can hopefully send to you all. But if your right to vote is challenged, the first thing to remember is you can still vote with a provisional ballot, and they should offer you a provisional ballot. If you get to the poll worker and they're looking you up in the poll book and it says that your right to vote is challenged, they should still offer you a provisional ballot, but if they don't, definitely ask for one. Know, though, that if you do get one of these provisional ballots, you're going to need to take additional steps to make sure your vote is counted. So that could be something like bringing in, proof of your right to vote or a correct ID or something like that within 3 days of your ballot. And they should tell you what additional steps need to be taken. But if they don't, definitely ask them what you're supposed to do. Many states now also allow you to track your provisional ballot status online. I know Florida and Georgia do for sure, and I know a lot of other states allow you to as well. So you can keep up with that and see, are they looking at it? What's the status? Do you need to take any more steps? So I'd really keep on that if this does end up happening to you or someone else that you know. And just remember that you have a right to vote, and your vote is really important, and don't let anyone take that away from you. And this is especially, it can be very intimidating when someone says, your right to vote has been challenged. Just know that you have a right to fill out that provisional ballot and to take the steps to get it counted. And I really would encourage you to do that. So now that we can identify these tactics, we know our rights, we have our plan all set to go. What do we do when we get to the polls and see voter suppression and then intimidation going on? We've got 3 easy steps. We want to document, call, and notify. So step number 1 is one of the most important ones. The basics of documenting what's going on is we want to know what, where, and when. So we want to know what's going on, where it's happening, and what time. And for specifically like white supremacist groups and people like that, I would definitely try and identify what they're doing and what they're wearing. Like, do they have some type of identifying information or uniform or insignia, some type of sign or flag that they're carrying around? I definitely make note if they're carrying some type of like firearm or weapon. And then, what actions are they engaging in? Are they patrolling around like the police? Are they doing some type of coordination of their actions? Are they just even like talking to people outside their group or provoking or threatening violence? And then after people see them and speak to them, are they leaving? Are they actually working to suppress the vote and it's working? And then see if they have a leader as well. And just to remind you, I mean, here I'm talking about white supremacist groups and individuals, and I'm thinking about those militias and things like that. This can be a lot more subtle as well. It can be something as easy as people spreading disinformation about, maybe your state doesn't have a voter ID law, but these people are coming up to people in line and asking if they've got their ID and spreading disinformation about needing one. It's really important to document those things as well. I would like to note that the most important thing here is to keep yourself safe first. You don't have to video record or write anything down in the moment if you don't feel like it's safe to do so. Just kind of make a mental note of like about what time, what's going on, and then when you feel like it's safe, either write it down or, call a friend and be like, hey, this is what went on, and I just am telling you so that I can keep it, fresh in my mind and repeat the story. So document it as soon as you feel it's safe to do so, but definitely don't put yourself at risk to try and get a picture or a recording if it's not safe to do so. So after we document what's going on, then again, as soon as it's safe to do so, we want to call the election protection hotline. So these are the numbers. They have English language hotline, which is 866 our vote. They also have a Spanish language hotline. They have Asian Pacific Islander language hotline, and then they have an Arabic language hotline. They also have a video hotline where you can video call someone if you or someone else speaks American Sign Language. That's a good resource as well. The other thing I note about the election protection hotline, and I guess this kind of goes to step 3, which is notify, but some of these election protection workers are going to be at polling locations. They're not going to be at every polling location, but they will be wearing, like t-shirts or some identifying information saying like 866. And you can also talk to them as well, and they can connect you with this hotline and help you out. They're generally outside. States have different rules, but they're generally outside the polling locations, and they can help you out if you encounter problems when voting. But again, they're not at every location, so take the number down for yourself as well, just in case they're not at the location where you are. So step 3 is notify. So if something is going on outside the polling location that is working to intimidate voters or suppress the vote, or people are spreading, disinformation, any of those things that we just talked about, we want to let the election officials know who are going to be inside the polling location, or, someone with like marked something who's an election official outside the polling location, if it feels safe to do so. Obviously, again, we're safety at the polls, so don't do anything that puts yourself at risk. But if it is safe to do so, those people are going to be the best people to notify, because they're going to be able to get the people who are intimidating, spreading disinformation, working against the right to vote. They're going to be able to hopefully get those people to leave. So that's the easy 3-step process. So how do we vote safely during racial uprisings in addition to all those things we just talked about? I'd say the number one thing to do is to have a team with you. And that team doesn't have to be in person, standing right next to you. If you do have someone that during COVID-19 has been limiting their exposure and you feel safe bringing them with you to the polls, that's a great option. But if you don't have someone that you feel comfortable, standing right next to at the polls, have someone virtually who's on your team and there for you. Tell them your voting plan, tell them when and where you're voting, and then make sure to connect with them. Say like, hey, when I'm voting, I'm going to update you every, 20 minutes on like where my status is in line. I'm still standing here. Oh, I voted and I'm done. So that in case one of those check-in points goes by without them hearing from you or something like that, they can kind of know something's amiss and know that you might need some help. You might need someone to come check in on you at the polls. So just have a team, make sure people know where you are, what you're doing, so that you can stay safe. Also, if you are being intimidated by one of these like white supremacist terror groups or just anybody at the polls, it's important to be as calm and as respectful as possible, but also to know that you do have a right to stand in line and to vote, and these people actually don't have a right to stand there and intimidate you. And being calm and respectful is difficult, of course, especially when someone is not being calm and respectful towards you. But a lot of these white supremacist terror groups actually, especially some groups like the Proud Boys and things like that, their goal is to rile people up and to make them be the aggressor first so that they can have this victim narrative. And it's important to not play into that because that's just giving them exactly what they want. So actually by being calm and doing these de-escalation techniques of just being calm and respectful, but also firm in that, like, I have a right to stand here and vote. That's exactly what they don't want to happen. So it's a little bit of resistance in that way while still being calm and de-escalating the situation. And if something happens and you do feel the need to leave the polls, you can always try again later, especially if it's in the early voting period, and maybe you can switch your polling location, or maybe you can just go back later when those groups are not present at the polls or those people are not present at the polls. But also, it is important too that if someone was trying to intimidate you at the polls or your vote was suppressed, to share your story. There are forces actively working to stop people from voting, and so in order to get some good legislation passed, some groups like Fair Fight, which is Stacey Abrams' group, they're trying to collect these stories so that when we do go to have another voting rights legislation or something, we can share these stories of people who were intimidated at the polls and whose votes were suppressed. So I have a link here to the Fair Fight organization, but I know other organizations are collecting these stories as well. Local news stations are probably collecting them, and it's a way that you can help move this effort along by sharing your story if you have one. Yeah. So you've already voted. Yay. Now what do? We want to make sure that our community has the tools and the information it needs to vote safely. So say you're listening to this and you're like, yep, I've already voted. Make sure you share this information with your people and everyone you know. You can also sign up to text or phone bank to help get out the vote. There's a bunch of different organizations where you can do this. PWN actually has a Get Out the Vote volunteer line if you want to text folks who are in our communities to get them out. So that's a great option. You can also sign up to be an election defender through the Front Line, which is an organization by the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project, and also the Working Families Organization. So election defenders are people who are going to provide voters with PPE, they learn these de-escalation techniques, and they also can contact different networks and lawyers if there's trouble at the polls. If you're interested in something like that and you feel like that's safe for you, that's a great option as well if you've already voted to do on election day. They do have a training coming up on October 29th, so if you do want to do that, you have to sign up soon. Great, and so now we're going to have Tana share some stories from the field. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see Tana. So Tana is our PWN member from Houston. She founded the Greater Houston area chapter, now the Texas chapter of.
No, I was one of the founders. I was not the founder. No.
Oh, okay. Sorry, but I'll let Tana take it away with her stories on voting.
Hi, everyone. I am Tana Pradia, and I am a part of PWN Greater Houston. Me and a group of ladies co-founded the Houston chapter, which is now the Texas chapter. We are proud Texas chapter. Uh, but during our efforts as far as our GLTV work, we have right now we have reached over 75,000 voters on phone banking. We have reached at least 10,000 text banking. But we have a team of people that are poll monitors that are watching the polls. And here in Houston, we have recently put together a Slack uh, way for our team to, if they see voter suppression or have problems with the people being able to vote, we have a direct link to the Harris County office. So we don't have to wait to see if there's going to be someone to come to the polling location to help voters cast their ballots. But the main thing is, here in Harris County has over 1.7 million voters that are has done mail-in ballots, and Harris County has 10 counties, but we only have one drop-off for mail-in ballots. And when you think about 1.7 million voters that receive mail-in ballots, and you only have one polling location, Harris County is big. Houston is huge. I call that real voter suppression and intimidation, um, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as my team is concerned. We have early voting. We have 120 polling locations. We have a team that goes out daily to pass out snacks and water here in Houston. Um, and we do Facebook Lives. You know, we tell our community that if you don't trust mailing in your ballot, you can take that ballot to the polling location with you and vote in person. But we have had a couple of friends that actually shredded their mail-in ballots and went in person, but they were still able to vote, but they had to go through a long process of filling out more paper, more documents. But you are able to vote. But the main thing is for our community, and for people living with HIV and people affected by HIV, we need to wear masks. We do have 6 feet apart. They do have hand sanitizer stations here. They do give you a finger condom to control the dollar, and they do actually give you a wipe to wipe the machine down before you actually cast your ballot. But uh, we encourage everyone, if you haven't voted, early voting is the safest way to vote. It really is. Because here in Harris County, you can vote anywhere in Harris County, but the problem is our community don't know that they can vote at any polling location. So if we're at the polling locations and the lines are wrapped around the corner, we can tell them, hey, you can go 5 minutes away and there's no line. Or you can go to harrisvote.com and you can pull up the wait list to see which polling locations has less people. Uh, but it is so important that our community understands, look at the ballot before you go to the polling location, know who's on that ballot, and already have an idea of who you're going to vote for before you get there. And one of my members said, since we can't take anything into the polling locations, write it in the middle of your hand. You know, if you know how we used to cheat in school, just scribble scratch in the middle of your hand or down your arm. They can't say anything, and cast your ballot. I mean, for the first time in Harris County, we have had so many people already cast their ballots the first time in Harris County, first time in Texas. So, you know, this is a very important election. And we also tell people, if you go into the polls to vote, take somebody with you. You know, do a buddy system. You know, take somebody to the polls with you. If you have elderly family members and they can't stand in those lines, every polling location in Harris County has curbside voting. We also have October 29th. We have 10 locations that are going 24 hours. You can vote 24 hours on October 29th. We also have polling locations that have drive-through voting, which makes it so much easier and safer for our community and our elderly. And, you know, we have preconditions. So that is making it so much safer for our communities through a pandemic. This pandemic has scared people, but what I'm hearing out in community and from family members is that they don't care about the pandemic. It is too important to get out to vote. You know, if I gotta stand there, I'm gonna get out to vote here in Texas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tana. That was awesome. A lot of great suggestions and everything in there. I'm gonna share my screen one last time if that's okay, Vanita. Just I have my resources page just so people can see all of that. Okay, great. Okay, here. Let me share real quick. Sorry about this. Here we go. Great. I'm sorry. I'm on. It's not working now.
Oh, really?
Oh, wait. Here it goes. Now I can see it. It just wasn't working for me, I think. All right, great. So here's where you can get some voting information. Vote.org is great. I mentioned iwillvote.com. 538 actually is keeping up on a lot of changes. If your community is seeing a lot of changes, I know this is the case in Texas, has a ton of changes going on. They're great for that. And then also the local county election officials. And then these are just the two things I had on some earlier slides about challenges to voting laws and those laws about terrorist groups as well. And just for our next steps, make your plan, pack your toolkit, read about your rights, and then go vote. And like Tana said, definitely bring a buddy with you to go vote if you can.
Yeah.
But
it's one thing that we have to remember also. This is not just about the presidential election. This is about state and local. These elections are crucial for every state. So, you know, the presidential election is just one piece, but we got to remember these state and federal seats and all of that is important because that's where our education comes from. That's where our health care. I mean, we're fighting for LGBTQ plus rights. We're voting for women's rights. So all these elections are crucial to our community at large.
Thank you, Tana. That was amazing. And Allie, so appreciate you both. That was really, really good information, a lot of good information. I've been monitoring the chat box and folks, if you have a question or anything, now is the time. Allie, you did a wonderful job. And I hope you all understand what we're trying to do now, what the risks are for voting, some ways to stay safe, some ways to know what you're seeing when you're there, whether it's intimidation or suppression. And even if folks aren't voting, can't vote now, still continuing to get folks registered, because access to voter registration is another voter suppression tool. And folks not thinking they have the right ID, or it's just, you know, in Texas, we can't do it online or whatever. So please, get information, stay informed, and share this information with others. As I said, we are recording this, and we will share this recording with Emory, our folks at Compass, and on our website as well. So I'm trying to, and Nina, thank you. It's good to go out early in case there are issues. You can always go back. That is so true. So folks, when I voted here, I got there a little bit before it opened on a Sunday, and was able to stand in line and was finished in about 15 minutes. I recognize that's not the case for everyone else, but get a buddy, do what you have to do to stay safe. Remember the resources and stay safe. Remember what we need to do and stay safe. I just can't stress that enough. In the chat box, we put a link to our evaluation. Please take a moment just to let us know. We're always trying to improve, and we want to make sure we're responding to the needs of folks, and that this webinar was informative of what people really need to know in this critical time. So I thank you all. And I appreciate you for taking time out of what is a really extremely busy time for everybody, and sharing sharing some virtual space with us today. So again, on behalf of the Compass Initiative, Emory University, PWN, and Georgia Equality, which I didn't mention at first, we are partnering to do this webinar series. I appreciate you, and thank you all. Tana, Allie, great job, really good job. And if there's no questions, you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you everyone for showing up. Bye.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.